right. Hey, everybody. Welcome again to the Next Gen GTM podcast. Today, I'm here with Kasey Devine, and he is the Vice President of Revenue for ProCare HR, and he has actually spent the last 10 years in the go-to-market space. So over a decade where he's been able to see, different motions, different ways to connect with customers. So we're so excited to have Kasey here. So Kasey, welcome. Please, we'd love you to kind of share a little bit more about yourself and your background, and then we'll get into some of the questions for today.
Yeah, for sure. Appreciate you having me. Long and short, if you stop listening now, I'm a nerd. Like I've been for the past 10 years in tech and tech-enabled outsourcing within human resources services, both in the SMB space and I'd say the middle market. Sometimes that's been verticalized, sometimes that hasn't. Got my MBA during COVID because I'm someone who doesn't sit still. And really what I've been diving into, especially the past 4 years or so, is how the go-to-market strategies are changing, especially when you really niche your product. So that's been something that's top of mind for me every day, and excited to dive into this more with you.
That is awesome. I find, it's funny, right? I find when I talk to folks leading B2B processes, there's a little bit of a nerd in all of us, right? There's that little bit of like, I know we're going to work on the soft skills, but give me some pipeline map and I am going to be happy on the inside. So we like to start out with the challenges, right? So lots going on in the space right now. Everybody's relooking at their playbooks, their tech stacks, their staffing, how they're running their go-to-market teams, because, two things are changing really, really fast. The tech available, but also the way in which buyers are starting to want to buy. So there's a lot of change, but then there's obviously some things that, we've talked to tenured sales folks like you for a long time that like don't change, right? That we have to keep those fundamentals alive. What are the biggest challenges you see folks trying to run B2B motions facing, literally right now?
Yeah, the biggest challenge I see for folks running B2B motions right now is I think you called it out. There are a lot more investment dollars going into the go-to-market enablement tech space, and parsing out which vendors are legit, which up and newcomers are worth paying attention to is difficult. And if you're going to be building or maybe even reevaluating a go-to-market tech stack, it can be honestly a full-time job just to figure some of that stuff out. The biggest thing though to me is that, unless you're dealing within something that is hyper commoditized and generally down market, folks at some point, if you have complexity to your solution, are going to want to interact with somebody. Even if it's as a quarterback in their buying journey, they're going to want to interact with you. And so really, I haven't seen as much as some people would care to suggest on changes in the actual sales process itself. I mean, in general, you have an intro call, maybe some of the things or the one-liners you're saying in there are different. If you have something that's SaaS enabled or a physical product, you're going to demonstrate it when it's applicable, and then there's some sort of negotiation in close. What's different, especially with the advent of AI-enabled tech tools, is outreach. And I think that I'm going to call it out now, starting to see the crest of the wave already, where maybe just pushing the more button doesn't necessarily make sense. And so when you go back into the predictable revenue model, which is classic with anybody who has funding, that was the answer, was more outreach. And I think this is one of the big problems is a lot of folks are still operating under the same assumptions of a book that was written about 20 years ago for something that made sense 20 years ago. And the thing that isn't called out is that the more button in that example was hyper-personalization. And I know that somewhere in the comments, someone's going to be like, well, my service does an AI-enabled hyper-personalization. And like, okay, yes, I get it. But where you actually can start cutting through the noise is places where you can connect with people and have a human team interaction. One of the things that I've actually seen, especially since I moved over to a newer organization, started really diving in my role in vice president of revenue, are industry events when they're applicable. I mean, one of the things that seems to be a trend is, since there is more information available, there's almost like when I said that wave was cresting, there's almost like a folding back in of being super specific on the problems you solve. And some folks are doing really great jobs of in-person and virtual events to get like-minded folks from a specific industry together. And I think that's going to be something you continue seeing moving forward over the next few years.
That's such an interesting. So you touched on some good ones. I like these. We got a lot to work with here, people. So stay on it. So several things I heard you say, like, yes, things are changing. No, like, we're not changing the fundamental kind of A to B to C process. But I thought what you said is something important for people. Like, hey, we've gotten to a top of a wave, right? Where we kind of almost had this like hysteria, right? This
Mm-hmm.
like, oh my gosh, like, they're genies, they're everywhere. It's AI now, like, and everybody's like it's like the California gold rush, but everybody's like suddenly stuck in Wyoming being like, wait, where are we? Why are we out here? Like, like I thought there was gold and now I'm confused, right? So I think, tell me more about that. I definitely think, we see it in the world that we live in. We see, there was a lot of a rush to kind of throw stuff together pretty quick, right? Like, connect some dots, you got your LLM, you're sticking it into stuff and like, it's going to be great, right? And now we're starting to see what I would say a new level of maturity required to be successful. But I want to hear more about what you were kind of talking about when you said that.
I mean, first of all, shout out to Wyoming because I've done some great hiking there. But outside of Wyoming, what I mean is, like,
on this podcast, it's not
nothing against, we are not anti-Wyoming on this podcast. What I mean by it is, hype aside and like the keynote speaker aside, automation, AI, I don't really care. It makes things go faster. Like, let's simplify what it actually is. And when you go backwards now to the old school sales manager saying, update your CRM, like, part of it is because you put garbage in, you get garbage out. And like, where I think some folks are failing is they think that just deploying a large language model or AI enabled tools is the answer. And in reality, it's just making things go faster that are horrible. And so you're just getting more bad results. And this is really something that's sad, I think, is there are a lot of go-to-market leaders, sales leaders, marketing folks out there that are sticking their necks out, being change agents on behalf of like the future and on behalf of some really great vendors. And you're running into some folks, these champions are running into folks who might see that and think that automation or AI is the problem. And it's not. The problem is like what we've been talking about since the predictable revenue book, which is data. And like, if you don't have good insights to draw on, none of that actually matters. And so, if you're going to crawl, walk, run, I think we need to, depending on your organization, really be honest about where you're at. And if today where you're at is we don't have good enough data to even pull to make insightful decisions, start there and start figuring out how you can track meaningful data that you would actually use to make decisions. Because you can plug into anything, but if that you don't have that, that's great. Even something unsolicited shout out, I purchased Gong semi-recently. Great. Well, within that, it takes time to get recordings in order to actually have insights with which they can help you. And so if you think, I'm going to write a check for X and there's AI here, and so we're just going to sell more, like, with effort, with execution, with a plan, 100% yes. And like, I don't want to downplay the gold rush because I do still think there's a lot of like blue ocean so to speak, of folks that, especially in some less likely to adapt industries, that like you can get some really big wins out of it. And maybe part of that problem, to sum it up, is I'm going to coin a term: champion enablement. Like pre-sale, you can see a bunch of stuff, even going back to another old book, and challenger sale of enabling a champion. But really even post-sale, because if someone's trying to do something truly innovative and trying to drive their organization forward, like deploying the solution isn't the end of the journey, it's the beginning.
I mean, yeah, that is something that I feel like it's so funny. Most people don't even get to, right? So like, because to your point, we're stuck on the first part. And what I loved, someone else said this on an earlier episode of this podcast: if AI is going to scale your laziness, you're going to get that result, right? If AI is going to scale the best in class playbooks that you took the time to create, and it's going to galvanize them into a process that can run 24/7, 365 at speed, that's where you're going to win, right? So I think, it was like, this isn't a license to be lazy. This is a license to take what you as a human are capable of and have technology work to scale that for you in an efficient and effective way. And exactly how you do that has to still be very much so based on the things kind of you talked about. And then the person, which is what I love about what you added, the person that's going to take that risk and say, I've got to get my company from here to this new playing field. I mean, it's almost like a founder within a company that is
in a way.
Risk. Yeah,
totally is. Like so I frequently oversimplify things and use unrelated examples, but I'm somebody who went on a few years back like a pretty big weight loss journey, and there's the constant marketing push of take this pill and you can lose weight, or really what you're missing is this product and this piece of equipment. And in reality, if you have a pair of shoes and like you can do push-ups and you can run up a hill, you can eat well, and if you do enough of those things, you'll actually get like at least 80% of the way to your goal if you do that consistently. And so related to all of this, where I would start if you're like, yeah, hey, we either false started on trying to deploy new tech in our go-to-market motion, or we've taken demos with a bunch of vendors before and we just haven't really done anything. Go back to what works, which is intentionality, and get out a whiteboard or a piece of paper or a Word document and outline what your process is. And I mean, hopefully you can at least have enough anecdotal evidence to understand whether that works for your customer. And I mean, if you're in business and your revenue's going up, that's enough anecdotal evidence. And if it's going down, it's probably enough anecdotal evidence. So there you go. Assuming you found product market fit, or really more market product fit, I like to reverse those things when talking about it. Then figure out what your process is from this contact or this organization is a complete stranger to our brand, all the way into not that they've onboarded, but they've actually referred this business. I think is really the close of that loop in a sense. I would think, what are the most labor intensive parts of that? Figure out what the problems are. If you wanted to do 50% more and hire nobody else to do it, what problems are standing in your way of doing that? And I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't do this, but it's just a frame of mind. Then go look for solutions that solve that. Because otherwise, and this is again, no knock on those salespeople, because they're doing their job and they're really actually providing a lot of value. If you go in thinking that I'm just going to do a Google search and look up the top 10 go-to-market tech things, and you're going to take demos and deploy some of the ones that work, and that's going to solve your problems, you're going to be back at what you said, the laziness. And if you're going to start intentionally, or if you're wanting to make sure that this is productive and it isn't something that's a false start and actually does make an impact on anybody who's a stakeholder in your organization, at least begin with the end in mind and come in being the buyer that you wish you had, which is somebody who has a clear problem statement.
It's funny, right? Because we see the same thing. So you mentioned before you started talking about, guys, it's about it's about being intentional. It's about looking at the data that you do have. And it's about challenging yourself to say, what part of this process is keeping me from scale? What are the areas? And it's really interesting, right? Because when we go talk with businesses about those same things, we see a lot of them being like, I now need to categorize and transcribe every written document that has ever been presented inside my organization. And then I will create this superhuman and I will not need humans. And we're just like, what are you talking about, dude? Like, think about how much data is just in your CRM that's going unanswered, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you look at that process that you talked about and you map it out, how many people are visiting your website that you're not reaching out to in under 5 minutes? How many people said, I'm not interested today, but reach out to me in a month? And that's not getting done. Like, I think it's really interesting, right? Because when we go in, we see there's so much data that is there, right? We always complain like, oh, they don't update the CRM. Updating the CRM is just the part of it, right? You actually have to take an action on that update. So I loved what you talked about like, guys, like, we might be trying to make this so big that we're missing maybe some of that more low-hanging fruit that really is could make a big difference. Like, is that something you guys see?
Well said. Yes, that is it. But so let's go back 10 years ago, and you think of the state of go-to-market back then. It wasn't that you didn't have successful companies, because there were successful companies and they were built on the backs of successful sellers. What were they doing? They had like a trunk box with files in the back of their trunk. Typically, if they use the really sophisticated ones, set an Outlook reminder to follow up with someone in 3 months. Whoa, right? And then they would map out their calls and make sure that they actually follow some sort of an intelligent cadence. They did the basics really well, and where the wins is good process going faster. Good process going faster. So if I'm just going to spam a bunch of people because I can. Like, that never worked. And why would you expect that to work now? And signing up for a service that gives you 100 different domain names to get around privacy restrictions and spam restrictions, that doesn't matter. You're just being louder and annoying. So the low-hanging fruit is huge. Like, one of the things that if you are going to deploy an AI-enabled tool, one of the easiest places that I see it personally is on like chatbots that connect into the website, that you can train up on some basic stuff on your strategy. You could connect it to a really simple PDF or Word document where you write down every question that you've ever gotten that you can think of and the answer, at least to parse out who's a sales lead and who needs help from a CS standpoint and get them help faster. You know what I mean? Like, that's something that I would recommend doing. Call recording, when done within privacy laws and all of that kind of thing, phenomenal, because the way you remember something isn't the way that it actually usually happened. And some of those automations are great. And I would start with the basics. Like, get really good at something. Pick a tool, pick one thing, and get amazing at that for the next 90 days. Don't try to get 10 things and be like C+ on all of them and wonder when your contracts are up.
It's so funny, hearing you say that as a buyer, because I also feel like it's almost like you want to tell the builders that too, right? Because, you think about like those chatbots, and you mentioned a few things. Like, one, they're helpful. People understand, like, they went to your website, they don't want to wait 6 hours for you to call them back. Like, they have an inquiry, and we're kind of used to it, right? Like, I know when I go to certain places, I'm like, I know that I'm getting an automation. It's part of my journey to the human. So, okay. And then what I think is really robust there, even for the builders, and this is why we push like focus, is that chat though still has to be curated, right? Because sometimes they want you to just answer their question.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they want you to, be clear on their use case. And you mentioned kind of almost filtering, right? And then I think what's really interesting, and we've talked about this a little bit, is you have what the buyer wants. Like, I want to come in with my use case and get my answer and decide if I want to pay for it and be gone. And then you have what the seller wants, right? Which is, I want to expand your attention and your use case so that I can maximally value my product. And I think what'll be really interesting in the AI chatbot space is to continue to see how that AI can start to bridge that gap, right? So for example, when do you answer the question, and when do you start to move them towards a human as quickly as possible because you've identified that this person needs to get in front of a human? And that's a place that I find personally fascinating. We spend a lot of time there, but it really is that human nuance, right, of AI to HI, where you've got to be able to figure out how to program in those calls, right? If a lead comes in and you ask them these questions and they answer in this way, it's human time, man. Or it's not human time. We need to send them a PDF and send them on their way, right?
Yeah. Beta test it. Like, I don't know what's so wrong about that. So if you're going to build a chat function, deploy people in the chat first and make sure that people are comfortable with it. Yes, no. Maybe your buyer and maybe your contacts aren't. Like, start there before you get fancy. And then you can be like, all right, what are the top 5 questions that we get that are easiest to answer? And maybe you deploy automation to try to get those. You know what I mean? Like, just going 0 to 100, you're going to miss stuff and it's going to be bumpy. And, like, as any change curve, to use that bump analogy, you're going to go over certain potholes no matter what. Just, A, don't be surprised about them. And B, realize that if you're going faster, you're going to hit the ceiling of your car. Like, and expect it. That's a lot of it. I mean, I want to go back to one of the things I said, which is, if you're going to try to modernize your go-to-market motion, like, really first understand what it is. And that's not that hard, and really only you guys can answer that. You're in your organization, you know what you're intentionally trying to do or not, or at least, even if you're not trying to do it, what usually happens in a few different scenarios. Then at least go to market then with, again, problem statements. I would say that if you're going to be, this is pro seller for a sec, go with problem statements, not identified solutions at first, because you're by definition ignorant to how to actually solve the problem because you have the problem, and that's okay. But saying, like, again, another example, I want an iced chai tea latte with skim and whatever else versus I'm thirsty. Like, a lot of buyers, if you're going to be, like, responsible and learn and really see what is the cutting edge, go into the market saying I'm thirsty, not, what your drink order is, at least at first, because you don't know enough to be able to even say that.
That's such a good metaphor. And what's really interesting, you touched on this at the beginning and a little bit just then, this choice to modernize a stack, it still takes risk, right? Like, there's some risk there, right? We want, I mean, especially in your pipeline, right? Like, no one, we're ready to kind of have funsies with, like, I don't know, the internal happy hours, but, like, some of these meetings, we're not ready to risk that. It sounds like too, there's also this quote, right, that went viral of, like, I don't want AI to write my poetry and be creative for me. I want it to do my laundry, right? So that I can make the sales magic happen. How do you think about the right risks that people should be taking and or the rewards, right? Because that's another piece of this, right? If you just think about the risk, you're not going to get that reward, because at the end of the day, in sales, it's a competition. So how do you think about risk and reward in this space?
Another analogy for you to think about risk and reward when you're deploying new things. Look to the past and stop thinking that this is the only time we've ever faced innovation and had to figure it out. So, easy example. And it's not that hard to see this, even though I don't know if anyone listening to this podcast was alive to see this transformation, but it's still relatively recent, is the automobile. And what that initially promised, and there's a bunch of history outside of that I won't nerd out on you about, but it promised to get you from point A to point B faster. And it did, after a change curve. What did people do after that? They moved farther away. And so the problem that was solved actually now isn't solved. And now folks are again now looking for time back in their day. So getting back into it, like, again, like, figure out what the problem is and figure out why it actually matters and what you're going to do with it. You know what I mean? So okay, we're going to cut our CAC by 10%. That's the thing. Why? Like, okay, to make more money. Like, okay, well, are you going to reinvest that money? Right? Does that mean that we're going to be able to hire more people? Does that mean that our investors are happy, which is a fair point? You know what I mean? Like, what's behind it? And so I think that's one of the things I would say in answer to your question. It's just like, look to the past, because there's so many different examples of change that has come, and really good ways that people adopted it and ways that they didn't. Like, it's not rocket science, and sometimes it actually is. But, like, you know what I mean? Like, we're not the first time to have disruptive things happen. It's been happening for years.
It's so interesting. And, you know, you talked a little bit there about like the KPI and the why behind the KPI, right? So, you know, we hear people talk about speed to lead, right? How fast? But why? Does that literally mean I just have to send you an email and I get a gold star? Or does it mean I have to acknowledge that you downloaded a specific piece of content, or I need to nurture that interest? Like, what, like that speed to lead KPI, number of minutes from point of, you know, interest, it's the why. And same thing with, like, you know, we hear people talk about, you know, meeting show rates, like they're down, they're up. Well, why? Right? Is it because we're talking to too many people that aren't that interested? Or is it because, you know, we're not getting to them fast enough? Or is it because we're, you know, we didn't set it up right so that they felt momentum coming into that call? I think that's a really interesting reframe about the why behind the KPI, to get to a root cause of why the number is what it is. And then saying, okay, I need to have speed to lead, but I need this specific interaction to happen, and I need it to be based on this specific behavior that the customer had. And that's what's actually going to move the needle to get the number back where you want it to, versus just saying, oh, I put in an automation and it got me there really, really fast with all the lazy stuff that doesn't resonate.
So yeah, within go-to-market, we're talking about core root causes, and you said start with why. Great TED Talk, great book. And even then, if we're talking about speed to lead, and there's a KPI that's down, not that, okay, is that KPI lowering actually something that's hurtful or harmful, or is it just something that we're observing? You know, not every blip is something that you should respond to. And so again, start with like the end in mind, figure out what your problem is, and then go back to some really boring, basic, but sound business advice. Like, start with what your assumptions are, show what the data backing those assumptions is, and what you think, you know, like going even further back to science class, you know, like, here's my hypothesis, and you argue about that enough, and then you get to, yeah, you know, I think that is maybe the right hypothesis based on some of the right assumptions. Then start small and fire bullets and get more data points so you can understand if it was the right thing and whether or not this is worth further time and money investment. And then go all in on it when you have more proof points. But just like, in what other part of the business would it be okay to oscillate as much as go-to-market, either sales or marketing does? Like, if your customer service team changed the way that they interacted with customers fundamentally every 6 months, you wouldn't be in business. If like the core product, like the software you're selling, was recoded every 6 months or a year completely, or you like reformulated whatever drink you're selling or whatever it is, like you wouldn't have customers. So like, act like you're part of the business. And I think that's a gripe on most go-to-market sales related folks is, we're siloed. It's like we're siloing ourselves because we're completely ignoring reality of how business works and then wondering why people won't take us seriously.
I love it. Well, we always get to this part later on in the podcast where we ask. So, you've run revenue teams, you've run big motions, long time. You're talking to 3 other, guys in your seat that are looking for advice. What are the 3 things that you're telling them based on everything we've talked and everything that's going to help them get that competitive edge, but in a smart way?
People, and people are my 3 things I would help someone understand their competitive edge. And I will say 3 different things about people so that I'm not just being funny. So the first thing about people is hire and retain the right people. And that starts with like actually investing in them, understanding what makes them tick, showing them care with time and coaching, and understanding that you're not always going to be able to buy the solution to your problem. Sometimes you need to build it. And that comes from coaching and developing people. Second thing with people, you're selling to people, not robots. Like, stop the war of AIs trying to filter each other out and make human connections, because that always has worked. And if you can find ways to automate it, great. But like, it's the people side that's the person who signs the DocuSign is a person. It's not a robot. So that's the second thing. The third thing on people, when we're talking about, it'll go back to it, your network. So many leaders, salespeople, marketers view relationships binary. It's can you help me today or not? Do I think you can help me today just by looking at your LinkedIn or your bio or not? And like, that is just so short-sighted, because you never know when someone takes a career move or when they're actually the buying decision maker at your ICP, or when you are unfortunately subject to layoffs and you need a job and that person actually has one, or just like when they're going to, because there's somebody who sees the world different than you, maybe say something you haven't thought of, which I know, like if you're prompting ChatGPT, that's possible. But like, that's actually part of the answer. So it really is people. Like, go back to it and see that's the lazy part of a lot of orgs today is not putting in the hard work to form relationships with other people and to be vulnerable enough to do it, and to be willing enough to act the fool, to be bad at it while they're getting good at it. But like, nobody on any of those 3 examples about people, nobody will fault you for trying.
It's so funny. Again, you can go back to that advice should go to the tech too, right? Like, if you are not buying products, building products, advocating for products that are designed to authentically connect humans, I just don't see it working, right? Like, and to do that, to create, because a lot of people talk about this, and you mentioned, get back to that wave, right? That because I think artificial intelligence is about bottling up a human experience, and that is a lot harder than people think, right? And a lot of this is, if you're not building this idea of technology, whether you're building or buying, that is designed to enhance and improve human connection, I just don't think it stands the test of time. Like, I just don't think, you mentioned that car, but that car drives you to, your grandmother now, or it drives you to, like, there's this role that it now plays. And I think that's what we've got to be pushing our tools to, right? Is not replacing the human connection, but taking out all of the barriers to it, and enabling the people to do what people do best. So I love that you kind of ended with people, And I think, whether you're the builder, you're the buyer, you're the user, we should be advocating for technology that enhances and equips people. So I love that. I love that so much. Well, Kasey, thank you for coming in and giving us some thoughts. We really appreciate it. And we've loved having you on. And yeah, we'll post some more about this, and folks can connect with Kasey, especially because I know he said some stuff that I'm sure we all want to hear a little bit more about. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.